We are remembering Dolly Parton this morning. The country music legend died Tuesday in Nashville at 80. Her team says she passed peacefully after a brief battle with cancer.
Two names almost never appeared in the same headline for nearly 10 years, until August 25, 2026, when Dolly Parton died at 80, and the man in the Oval Office responded in a way almost nobody expected. For years, Donald Trump tried to honor her, and for years, she quietly, politely, and repeatedly turned him down. So what actually happened between a president who wanted to hand her the nation's highest civilian award and a singer who refused to let politics anywhere near her name? The real story of their strange, respectful distance says more about both of them than any single headline ever could. Long before anyone was talking about flags at half-staff, there was a much quieter story playing out behind the scenes in Washington. During his first term, Trump's administration tried twice to award Dolly Parton the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the country can bestow. Twice, she said no. Parton explained her reasoning years later in a 2021 conversation with NBC's Today Show. She said she couldn't accept the first offer because her husband, Carl Dean, was ill at the time, and she turned down the second because she didn't want to travel during the COVID-19 pandemic. On the surface, neither refusal was framed as a political statement. It read as a woman choosing her family and her health over a ceremony in the nation's capital, a choice she later confirmed in detail, making clear both offers had come directly from the Trump White House. What made the story more interesting is what came next. Once Joe Biden took office, his administration reached out about the very same honor, and Parton hesitated again, this time for an entirely different reason. She told Today that accepting the award under a new administration might make her look like she was picking a side. And picking sides was the one thing she'd spent her whole career trying to avoid, no matter which party was doing the asking. Reporting after her death laid out the full picture clearly. Parton ultimately declined the Medal of Freedom 3 separate times across 2 administrations, twice from Trump, once from Biden, making her one of the rare public figures to turn down the same national honor from presidents on opposite sides of the aisle. Even Barack Obama weighed in on the subject, years before any of this became relevant to his successors. During a 2020 appearance on a late-night show, he admitted on air that he considered it a mistake, a screw-up, in his words, that Parton never received the award while he was president, and joked that he'd call Biden about it personally. That admission only added to the sense that Dolly Parton had somehow become the one honor every administration seemed eager to attach to her name, and the one she kept quietly declining on the terms being offered. The contrast was striking, because Parton's reputation never depended on political access or presidential connections in the first place. Her influence came from decades of music, philanthropy, songwriting, and business, an ability to stay broadly admired without ever becoming permanently attached to one political camp. It's also worth noting how unusual that made her among the people Trump did successfully honor with the Medal of Freedom during his first term. Recipients included retiring Utah Senator Orrin Hatch, former NFL player and Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Page, and, posthumously, Elvis Presley. The Presley inclusion creates an interesting parallel, because like Parton, he became something bigger than a musician, a cultural symbol whose reach went well past the recording studio and the stage. Yet Parton's relationship with presidential recognition stayed noticeably different. Her reluctance wasn't necessarily a rejection of the honor itself. It looked more like part of a broader pattern, one where she seemed careful about accepting any political association that might overshadow the work she'd spent her whole life building. That distinction mattered. Parton had cultivated an image that crossed generational, regional, and political lines, letting fans with very different beliefs find something in her story to hold on to. By the time Trump's name became attached to her legacy in any meaningful way, that legacy was already firmly established. Her career had survived shifting musical fashions, cultural controversy, and decades of public scrutiny, without ever requiring her to become an outspoken political figure. Her foundation had been built on music, generosity, and personal independence, not proximity to power. That set up the next chapter. Trump's repeated attempts to associate his presidency with Parton put her in a position where simply staying above the political conversation got harder and harder. A private refusal behind closed doors was one thing. A question posed publicly, with cameras rolling and millions of people waiting for an answer, was something else entirely. And that's where Parton's carefully maintained distance from presidential politics was about to face its most visible test. If declining an award behind the scenes was easy, doing the same thing live on camera was another matter entirely. In 2018, an ABC News correspondent sat down with Parton and pushed her more than once on the subject of Trump, a moment that would be recounted for years afterward as one of the clearest examples of her political dodging. The correspondent even tried to draw a comparison between the president and the sexually abusive boss character Parton had famously played against in her 1980 film 9 to 5. Parton wouldn't take the bait. She told him she wasn't going to address that, adding that she'd learned a long time ago to keep her mouth shut if she wanted to stay in show business, and reminding him plainly that she wasn't in politics. She was an entertainer. When he pointed out that she was also a role model with real cultural influence, she simply agreed. Yes, she said, she was, and that was exactly why she chose not to talk about people in the first place. The comparison being reached for wasn't subtle. In 9 to 5, Parton's character worked under a boss named Franklin Hart, a man written specifically to be sexist, controlling, and dishonest, the kind of character audiences were meant to despise from his very first scene. Asking Parton whether the sitting president reminded her of a role she'd played 4 decades earlier was about as direct as a question could get without simply asking her to say his name in a negative sentence. She still wouldn't give the answer being fished for. That interview became something of a blueprint for how she'd handle every Trump-related question for the rest of her public life. 2 years later, in conversation with USA Today, she said she refused to get tangled up in political things because she had roughly as many Republican fans as Democratic ones and didn't want to alienate either group by picking a side in a fight that wasn't hers to referee. She added that America had given everyone free speech, but that freedom came with the responsibility of being accountable for whatever you chose to say and do with it. Her own family history gave her the perfect line to sum it all up, one she leaned on for years whenever reporters pushed too hard on where she really stood. She'd joke that her father was a Republican, her mother was a Democrat, and that made her a hypocrite, a deliberate mispronunciation of hypocrite. It got a laugh nearly every time, and it also happened to be true in the most literal sense. A household split right down the middle, long before Trump was ever part of the conversation. She expanded on that philosophy in a 2021 conversation with People magazine, explaining that she knew whatever she said would be listened to closely and blown into something bigger than she intended. So she had to be careful with her words. She added that, of course, she had her own opinions. She just wasn't an opinionated person as a rule, believing that faith and personal belief were meant to be tools people used to help each other, not weapons people used against each other. It was a philosophy that applied just as much to Trump as it did to any other polarizing figure who tried to pull her into the conversation. That careful balancing act held up through Trump's first term, through his years out of office, and into his return to the White House. But it was tested in ways that revealed just how deliberate her neutrality actually was, especially once a global health crisis gave both of them a reason to intersect in a way neither one had planned. Not every connection between Parton and Trump involved an interview or an award ceremony. In April 2020, during the early and uncertain weeks of the coronavirus pandemic, Parton donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center to help fund early research into a possible vaccine, a gift that was later credited with playing a real role in the development of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine. That donation became known publicly as the Dolly Parton COVID-19 Research Fund, and it directly supported work being done in a lab at Vanderbilt that helped build the testing methods researchers needed to confirm a vaccine candidate was triggering a strong immune response. The federal government later poured roughly $1 billion of its own funding into Moderna's vaccine effort through the Trump administration's Operation Warp Speed program, meaning Parton's early philanthropy and the president's signature pandemic initiative ended up supporting the very same project, even though neither side ever framed it that way publicly. Parton never used the moment to praise or criticize the administration overseeing that funding. When asked about her motivation later, she said simply that she felt led to help because she knew something bad was on the rise, and that she considered her contribution a small part of a much bigger effort. She later admitted, in an interview with a UK radio station, that she probably got more credit than she deserved for the vaccine's eventual success, insisting her heart had simply led her toward doing what she felt she was supposed to do at the time. That modesty didn't stop the donation from becoming a small political flashpoint of its own once it resurfaced online, with commentators arguing over how much credit belonged to her philanthropy versus how much belonged to the federal dollars the Trump administration poured into the same research. Parton stayed out of that argument entirely, just as she stayed out of every other one involving the president, letting the science speak for itself while the internet debated who deserved the bigger share of the applause. By the time the 2016 election rolled around, Parton had already perfected the art of saying just enough to satisfy reporters without ever actually taking a side. When comments she made about Hillary Clinton were interpreted by some outlets as an endorsement, she moved quickly to clarify that she hadn't endorsed anyone at all. Asked directly to weigh in on the matchup between Clinton and Trump, she called the entire race the greatest show on television and described both candidates as nuts, a line that let her acknowledge the chaos of the moment without endorsing either person in it. It was classic Parton, funny enough to make headlines, vague enough to avoid controversy, delivered with just enough charm that almost nobody pushed back on it. That same instinct carried into her later years, even when her own choices put her neutrality under a microscope in a very different way. In 2023, she released a duet with the conservative-leaning musician Kid Rock on her Rockstar album, and faced some backlash from fans who felt the collaboration clashed with her carefully maintained image. She told an entertainment outlet that loving her didn't mean she couldn't also work with someone else, and that she preferred to accept people rather than condemn them outright over their politics or their mistakes. She tied the whole philosophy back to her Christian faith, arguing that people deserve forgiveness rather than permanent judgment. Even the idea of running for office herself, a fantasy plenty of celebrities have flirted with over the years, got a hard no from Parton whenever it came up. Speaking to a magazine in 2023, she joked that the country had already had enough boobs in the White House, and said plainly that she wasn't qualified for that kind of job, adding that she preferred to make her difference through music instead of legislation. Reporters kept trying anyway year after year, because a direct political opinion from someone as universally beloved as Parton would have been a genuinely valuable headline. Every single time, she found a new joke, a new deflection, or a new gentle correction that let her stay exactly where she wanted to be, adored by people who otherwise agreed on almost nothing else about the state of the country. For nearly a decade, that was the entire relationship between Dolly Parton and Donald Trump. An offer made and declined, a question asked and deflected, a joke told instead of an opinion given, and one quiet philanthropic overlap that neither side ever tried to spin. Nobody could have predicted that the moment their names would finally be linked in the biggest headline of all would come not from an award ceremony or a campaign trail, but from a hospital in Nashville. Parton died on August 25, 2026, at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, after what her publicist Marcel Pariseau described as a brief battle with cancer. Her nephew and longtime head of security, Brian Seaver, confirmed the news in a video posted to her social media accounts, and tributes began pouring in almost immediately from across the entertainment and political worlds. Trump's response came quickly, and it stood in sharp contrast to the years of careful distance that had defined their public relationship while she was alive. He posted a tribute on Truth Social calling her one of the greatest country singers ever and describing her death as a true loss for millions of people. He wrote that there had never been anyone like her and there never would be again, closing the message by wishing her rest and adding that the world loved her. What made the moment stand out even more was the formal gesture that came with it. The White House issued a proclamation ordering flags at the White House, federal buildings, military posts, embassies, and naval vessels to be lowered to half-staff beginning that same evening at 6 o'clock, remaining down through sunset on September 1, 2026, a full week of national mourning. It was a level of formal national recognition that Parton had spent years politely avoiding while she was alive, arriving only after she was gone. That gesture also fit a pattern Trump had already established during his second term. Less than a year earlier, in September 2025, he'd ordered flags lowered nationwide to honor Charlie Kirk, a political activist, rather than an office holder, showing that Trump had grown willing to extend this kind of presidential discretion to cultural and political figures well beyond the traditional list of presidents, vice presidents, and members of Congress. Applying that same discretion to Parton, an entertainer who had spent her entire life insisting she wanted nothing to do with politics, was a striking twist that even long-time observers of presidential morning proclamations found notable. The reaction extended well beyond the president himself. Tennessee's congressional delegation offered some of the most personal tributes. Senator Marsha Blackburn called her an iconic leader who loved her state and her nation, while fellow Senator Bill Hagerty described her as talented beyond compare and an entrepreneurial force. Representative Diana Harshbarger, who represents the district where Parton was raised, said that no matter how big her star got, she never stopped being one of their own. Fellow musicians, including Reba McEntire, Dionne Warwick, and Casey Musgraves, shared their own personal tributes, alongside actress Julia Roberts, who had starred alongside Parton in Steel Magnolias, and called her a magical and joyous human being. Trump was far from the only political figure to weigh in, and the bipartisan nature of the morning underscored just how effective Parton's decades of studied neutrality had actually been. Former President Bill Clinton posted his own tribute, remembering how she rose from her East Tennessee roots and never forgot where she came from, and praising her lifelong commitment to giving back, particularly through her literacy programs. Seeing a Republican president order flags lowered nationwide, while a Democratic former president offered his own separate, heartfelt statement on the very same day only reinforced the point Parton had been making for decades, that her music and her generosity belonged to everyone, regardless of party. It's worth remembering that Parton spent her entire public life trying to stay out of exactly this kind of political spotlight, turning down honors, dodging interview traps, and joking her way past every question about where her loyalties actually stood. In the end, it wasn't an award ceremony or an endorsement that finally brought Trump and Parton's names together in the history books in any lasting way. It was a flag lowered in her honor, a tribute written after she could no longer decline it, and a nation, regardless of political stripe, pausing together to remember a woman who spent her whole career refusing to choose a side.